of the day. Thanks for being here. And I'm sure Adrian here is really excited to have you. So I'm really excited to introduce Adrian Travis today because Adrian here in 2012 helped me first think about development in a modular way. She was the one who was like, you need to break down your code instead of just having it all in one template. And what's important about that is that she explained it to me, who, I'm not an object-oriented programmer out of the bat. I'm more front-end thinking. She explained it in a way that made sense to me. And I'm sure she's going to be explaining her talk today that makes sense to you. She was a guest on my show way back when, so you guys can check that out too. And I'm happy to introduce to you this developer, jack of all trades, who's here to help you really think through your content in EE. Adrian, take it away.
Thank you all. Well, it's kind of fitting that we're going to be kind of improvising about the whole screen thing because, I feel like my greatest strength as a developer is improvisation, making things work even when they're not inclined to out of the box. So we'll have a good time today, I hope. As Leah said, this talk is about how to think about your content in ExpressionEngine, and basically what that means is I'm not teaching you a code technique. I'm not trying to teach you a step-by-step recipe. I'm trying to show you how to consider your problem space in a way that lets you develop sites that are forward-looking and that are easy for you to deal with and that are easy for your clients to enter content. So let's go. It's funny because I've been doing this my whole career, and I just learned within the last year or so that there's kind of a name for this sub-discipline, and it's called content modeling. It's a little bit different from data modeling, which is about how you structure an underlying database, because the thing about a content management system is your content management system already has a database. It's already got an underlying data model. What you are doing is kind of overlaying a second model on top of that that lets you deal with content. And so content modeling is about creating structure for the content that you're putting into your system. It's part science. It's also part art. I mean, that's the art part is kind of what I'm trying to teach you today. And you always want to be working with your tools and not against them. I mean, if you think about how much of a hassle it is trying to get a tool to do something that it's really not designed for, you want to avoid that at all costs. Fortunately, ExpressionEngine in particular is a really versatile tool, so it's not like trying to do everything with a hammer. You've already got a multi-tool. The first thing you always want to think about is capturing your content and figuring out what types of content you have and what kind of relationships they have. What are your things that you're talking about on your site, and how do those things connect to each other? So when we're capturing content, this is a part where I don't know how many of you work for small agencies and or by yourself as opposed to with big agencies, but I find that it's a really consistent problem getting customers to talk about their content at all. Like, they're just like, well, build us a website, here's some Photoshop mockups, blah, blah, blah. You can't let them do that because it always leads to problems down the road. You need to work from every source you have available. If they have a current website, comb through that thing. If they have promotional materials, look at those. You need the design mockups, but you need more than the design mockups because and I know that the design mockups never cover everything that you need them to cover. Oh, well, we needed to add pull quotes into some of these blog entries and they're not scoped in here. It's always a problem. So you always want to work from as much content as possible. You also need to consider a thing that I often find is a particular problem. You need to consider incidental content. Like, you've got a copyright statement in your footer, and a lot of times people just put that in a template. I have a very hard and fast rule. This is the only hard and fast rule you are going to hear from me today. Content should never live in a template. Never, ever, ever. Anything that has human words that humans need to read needs to be captured in your CMS, except under vastly unusual circumstances. Because what happens when you need to translate that content? What happens when your client calls you up at 3 in the morning because they're an Australian client? That would be me. I have an Australian client. And they desperately need for something to change, and they can't do it because it's buried 3 deep in a template. So always consider stuff like, oh, your mission statement that's at the top of every page, and your copyright footer, and all of those little nav menus and everything needs to not be in templates. And we'll talk more about how to deal with that in EE, all of those weird little one-off bits, because of course you don't just want little one-off bits running around everywhere, and I'll talk about some ways that you can handle that. Writing it down is also really important. You gotta make a diagram. No, really, you gotta make a diagram. Even if there's one channel and a couple of pieces of boilerplate on your site, make a diagram, because it's never gonna be that simple. Not ever. You're always gonna get in there and you're gonna find something that you neglected to cover. You do not have to use any kind of fancy design language for that diagram. Just lines and boxes, arrows is fine. That said, I really like ERD, which stands for Entity Relationship Diagrams. It's actually a way, its main purpose is actually for what I mentioned earlier, data modeling. It lets you talk about different kinds of relationships differently. I find it works really well for this kind of content modeling as well. I'm about to show you an example. And we're going to revisit this diagram a couple times. This is a simplified model, actually, of a project that I maintain for a book publisher in Australia. So what kinds of content do we have? We have books. You know, obviously they're a book publisher. That's kind of the main focal point of the content. Books have contributors. They're not just authors. They also have editors, translators, and illustrators. There's pages. There's pages on the site that do various things. They're landings, they're featuring content, etc. We have events. We have articles and videos. And then up here, remember I talked about that incidental content. We have a sort of a catch-all called boilerplate here. The arrows between them probably look a little weird to you unless you're familiar with entity relationship diagrams. These basically tell you what type of relationships we are looking at. I'm going to actually come over here for a second. Most of our relationships are what's called zero to many relationships. That means there may not be any relationship between a given item and a given other item, or there may be one, or there may be a whole bunch. So, and you read it from both ends. So this says contributors may or may not ever be linked to one or more events, and events may or may not ever have any contributors. So you have some events that may be just the book publishing company throwing an open house, but then you also have events where you've got one author doing a book signing. You've got events where 5 authors are doing a book signing. You've also got one-to-many relationships where you've got every contributor belongs to at least one book, is what this says. And the reason for that, why would we have an author in our system who doesn't have any books? That would be dumb. But books can have 0 or many contributors. You might have a book written by anonymous. It might have no contributors whatsoever. Articles and videos may or may not link to books. Books may or may not link to articles and videos. There are also one-to-one relationships. We just don't happen to have any shown. But again, entity relationship diagrams give you those tools. And once you've gotten the hang of reading them and remembering which end is which of the arrows, it really does make it quite easy to see at a glance what you're talking about. So this is a tool you should maybe pick up. But if you're not up for that, really just drawing boxes and arrows is fine. You just want to have a sense. And we're going to complicate this diagram later. Even the simplified version that we're going to do some live demo of is going to be more complicated than this. But this is our starting point. Content attributes. That's the bits of your things. You know, a book has a title. It has a cover. It has a number of authors, a number of editors, a number of translators, whatever. Your pages, they might have featured content, they have body copy, etc. In ExpressionEngine, you absolutely want to be thinking in terms of field groups, because at the moment we are still limited to one field group per channel. And this is actually the one place where EE doesn't give you everything that we would maybe like to have. So you want to think about field groups. You want to think about what content is similar and how you can group it together. My preference is for fewer field groups and duplicating them. And with that said, required fields limit your flexibility on that because you can't ever hide a required field. As much as possible, unless it's a really big site, trust your users, because there's going to be corner cases where even if you're not using the same field group for multiple types of content, there's going to be something where that required field is suddenly not applicable. There's always, as I'm sure you know, a balance between trusting your users and having them not screw it up. But err on the side of trusting your users as much as you can. I've actually, let's come back to this diagram quick. I've colored these separately to show you that we have a few different types of content. Events and articles can almost certainly use the same field group because they're going to be very similar. An article and an event are fundamentally very similar types of things. They have a publication date or an event date. They have some text. They have some links. There's going to be fields for one that aren't applicable to the other one, but you can hide those. Then pages are their own, and books are their own, and contributors are their own. Or it's possible that we can combine some of those later, but those are our initial assumptions. With repeating elements, you might want to be talking about relationships, or you might want to be talking about having some kind of field that repeats, either a grid or a blocks field or something. So when you're talking about having clumps of content that belong to other content, there's a couple different ways you can handle that, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Sometimes you really need everything to be in its own channel, and sometimes you don't, and you want to think about that hard. Can one-off content items be grouped together? This is back to that kind of boilerplate idea. Can we group those nicely? The answer is yes, spoiler. And we'll talk about that in a minute again. I'm going to be talking about some EE with some add-ons that I consider to be crucial here for some of this. Once you have thought about your attributes, add them to your diagram. We're not doing this whole thing here, the whole diagram again. I'm just showing you a piece of it. Your books have titles, subtitles, editions, reviews, cover images. Oh, look, we've surfaced some new types of content that we have to capture that have relationships. Reviews have a name, source, quote, link, but they need to be attached to books. Editions also need to be attached to books, have their own fields. The assembly model, this is a really handy concept from content modeling. Again, something I didn't really have the words for until recently. This has to do with how your CMS thinks about content. How many people have ever had to deal with WordPress in here? Yeah, so you know that basically out of the box, WordPress thinks everything is a post. Literally everything is a post. That's WordPress's assembly model. You can complicate that somewhat with third-party add-ons, but for the most part, it's really basic. Everything is a post. Oh, unless it's an image or a file, in which case those have their own metadata. But ExpressionEngine is more versatile than that. ExpressionEngine has entries, it has categories, it has file metadata. We have global variables, which are super handy, and we're going to talk about them. In a more complicated sense, templates are part of the assembly model because you can have content living there. You shouldn't, but you can. Routing lets you do some interesting things with content. And you've got complex field types like grids, things that repeat, things that let you connect a bunch of content into a sort of parent piece of content. The next thing I'm going to teach you is the most important questions you need to be asking yourself about your content types for ExpressionEngine. Does this content need its own URL? Let's revisit our sort of overarching publishing example here. Of course, books need their own URLs. You know, they're the centerpiece of our site. Authors almost certainly also need their own URLs. Do categories need their own URLs? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a thing that we need to think about. Pages obviously need their own URLs. Editions don't, because if I go to look at a book, what I want to see is what editions are available for me to buy. I don't want to have to click to another page about those. I want to see, here's the paperback, I can buy it. Here's the hardback, I can buy it. Here's the large print edition. So those don't need their own URLs. Do reviews need their own URLs? Almost certainly not. Again, so that's one of the really fundamental questions you should ask. And another question, and it seems less important, but I will get into why it is important. How many of them are there? Are you going to have 10 books or 1,000 books? 10 years from now, are you going to have 10 books or 1,000 books? Are you going to have 10 pages or 1,000 pages? Probably more like 10 in a lot of cases. I mean, a lot of websites are big in terms of routable content, but not so big in terms of content that's actually sort of in a nav tree. But anyway, you want to think about how many, not in terms of exact numbers, but in terms of orders of magnitude. Okay, now I've got a couple more slides, and then we're gonna do live demo, and the live demo part is where you're gonna have to be patient with me. I have an idea, but we're gonna have to make sure that it works. We have some secret weapons, or not really that secret weapons, but they're super important. Low variables is essential for the way that I work. Low variables is the thing that lets us group together and capture all of that weird little boilerplate content that has to go everywhere. Blocks is amazing. If you are not using blocks, you should be using blocks. Brian Litzinger, Bold-Minded, they're the ones who wrote it. Or rather, Brian Berger wrote blocks for ExpressionEngine 2, sold it to Bold-Minded, and then they apparently basically rewrote the whole thing for ExpressionEngine 3. I really cannot stress enough, this is going to solve content problems that you didn't even know you had. Rob Sanchez's entry type is a free add-on that a lot of people don't know about. It's kind of a well-kept secret, and I love it. And the other one that apparently did not make it onto my slideshow, it's not essential, but it's definitely something that I think makes your modeling easier for clients to deal with, is the structure add-on, which I think everyone's familiar with. And we'll see it in the demo here. So here's our diagram. We already know that it's more complicated than this, but we are gonna say basically, here's what we're going to talk about. And we're not going to get through all of this, but I want to show you and interact with you about how we talk about this stuff. Now I have to figure out how to end the slideshow. There we go. Ending the slideshow. So what I'm thinking, since I have an extended display and it will not duplicate, is that I am going to do stuff step by step and drag it over to that monitor. So that's how we are going to handle the live demo part. I think it'll work. We're not going to talk about templating and front-end stuff particularly at all today. We're just going to talk about building. I hope you are all not bored to tears in this 5-minute interval here. Okay, so let's talk first about our diagram, right? Okay, pages are really easy. Let's talk about pages. Are they a channel or not? Who says channel? Who says not a channel? Okay. Do you really say not a channel? Okay. Pages are a channel because pages are easy to do as a channel. We are going to create a field group called content, and we're going to assign it to a channel called pages. We actually have a couple field groups here. I will show you. We have that I pre-created. We have content, we have titles, and we have contributors. And then the content, and then we have the pages channel. And we're actually going to have the pages channel be in structure, which you do, of course, by just saying that the pages channel has pages and it's got a template. Are you all familiar with structure? Structure's super handy. What kind of content do we have in pages? We have body content, basically. We probably have a header image, and we have related content, which we can see in the diagram that we've said that pages can be related to books. Probably, realistically, pages can actually be related to literally any of these content types. We're not going to do a full build, so we don't need to worry about that. In order to handle relationships, here's the thing about pages with relationships. They're a little tricky, so we're going to come back to them because your featured content on your pages is probably not as simple as here's a list of things I want to show. You probably want to be able to do stuff with that content like slideshows or, lists separated by channel. So putting that aside for a second, let's go back to titles, which are the centerpiece of everything for a book publishing site, right? Titles. What does a book have? A book has a subtitle, which is probably just a text field. Yeah? Everybody agree with me on that? A book title, a book has a cover image. Or it might have multiple cover images, but we're going to say that it has a cover image. So that's a file. Is it required or not? Can you think of any circumstances where a book wouldn't have a cover image? I can. It's not published yet. They don't have the cover approved, but they're importing it onto the site to make sure that it's there. So we don't want to require that. I'm hoping that you are hearing me, that you are internalizing that I'm trying to walk you through these thought patterns. I'm not trying to condescend to you. I know that you're all grown-ups. I don't know how to explain this other than by kind of talking through the same kind of process that I go through. So we have file fields. We have reviews. Reviews are kind of neat because a review is a repeating thing. We might have several reviews for the same book, right? And we want to be able to show quotes from those reviews. So what kinds of things do we have in a review? We have the guy who wrote the review or the person who wrote the review. We have where the review appeared. We have a link, and we have a pull quote from the review. Now, first tricky question is that a channel or not? Go ahead.
Is the review always for one book?
In our model, yes. Correct. That would be my, I mean, I say correct. You could go either way. My inclination is absolutely not to have it be a channel because a review always belongs to a book. It never needs its own URL. It's only going to ever be shown where the book is, or in conjunction somehow with the list of the book. And it never needs to be related to anything other than the book. Here is where blocks is super handy, because if you did this in a grid, you would have this table thing, and trying to put your pull quote from your review in your tiny little table cell would be kind of annoying. And also, grid cells are limited as to field type more than blocks are. So let's take a look. I have already actually created a review block, and we're gonna show it here. and I've got to kind of come around where I can see. But we have a reviewer, we have a source, we have, no, there we go. I just needed the scroll bar. We have a reviewer, which is a text field, right? We have a review source. We have a review link, which is a URL. And the other thing is we can require and unrequire fields just like we do in grids. So you always have to have a name and you always have to have a link, but you don't have, or whatever, but you don't necessarily have to have the text. Where is my scroll bar? And we have a review quote, which we're doing as a rich text field because we want people to be able to put italics and stuff in it. The handy thing about blocks is that they're actually kind of stored separately from fields. Your blocks field can have several different types of blocks in it. So you don't have to recreate, this is the other major advantage over grids, you don't have to recreate basically the same grid if you need stuff in two places. So if we later added, say, magazines or something, and they also needed to have review quotes, we don't have to recreate that grid anywhere, we just have to create a new blocks field that has it. In order to add the blocks field to our field group, we just create a blocks field, type blocks, and then we grab it and pull it back where I can see it. We call it reviews. We can say that it's required or not. Do we think books are always going to have reviews? No, some books flop. So we definitely don't want this to be a required field. We do, and in the block itself, remember we said the name of the reviewer is required. So any block that somebody does create has required fields, but if nobody creates any, everything is fine. We tell the field that the only block type that's part of this field is review. You can always create new field types, by the way, or new block types, by the way, from in there if you need to. And then we save the field, and I'm going to show you something neat that it does, because blocks understands that it's kind of complex. Blocks will actually give you sample template code down here once you have saved the field and gone back into it. Which is handy, because if you've got a bunch of different types of blocks stored, and we'll see that in just a minute. Am I making sense? Are people understanding this? Here's another interesting problem with titles. And this is a real world problem. I actually ran into it when I was first developing the site for this book publisher client. There is a standard set of categories. There's actually two, but we'll talk about one. There is a standard set of categories for books. It's called the BIC system, B-I-C. I don't actually remember what it stands for, Book Identification and Classification or something like that. And all books by a book publisher get classified into these things because it's a way where their distributors can surface books and booksellers can surface books like, oh, I want to do a sale of all the books on military history, whatever. Are those categories? They sound like categories. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, does the client want them grouped by category?
Well, we're thinking about what kind of content they are. They are categories. They would always go, they sort of act like categories. They would be assigned to a book. There would be clustered.
Do you need a URL?
They do need a URL. Categories in EE can have URLs with the category reserved word, so that still hasn't ruled anything out. Let me tell you how many of them there are. There's about 4,000. And they're parent and child. Parent and child doesn't rule out them being categories. Having a checkbox category tree of 4,000 entries means that you should not actually make them categories. because not only, I am here to tell you, is it a giant hassle for the client to find them. They don't actually normally enter them manually. They're normally third-party imported, but they do sometimes have to go change them in this particular use case. But the bigger problem is that ExpressionEngine really does not like to display on the control panel publish form that 4,000 entry category tree, and it means that it takes upwards of 30 seconds for your publish form to even load. This is why I say, how many of them are there is always an important question to ask yourself, because it does affect your choices. So we do not make those things categories. We make them a channel. Like so. And then we go to our titles field group, and we create a relationships field. And we say, BIC categories. And it's actually a little more complicated than this, but again, we're doing the simplified model because for real book publishers, there's always a main subject and supplementary subjects, but we're just going to pretend that they can all go in. We're going to say that we're allowing relationships from big categories, any author, and we are allowing multiple relationships. Then our content has URLs, which it needs. You can still group all of them by you just have to do a relationship parents for the category pages. So we can have a URL really easily. We can edit really easily. They're very simple. You only need 2 fields. You basically need the number and the name of the category. You don't even have to store a description. But we are not running into complicated problems with not being able to display our publish form.
Does your client then have to create the book in the correct channel to begin with? Like, do they have to say, oh, I'm creating a military history book versus a science fiction book?
No, because we just do it as a relationship. We just make bit categories a relationship inside the titles channel. And we have and bit categories are a set group. That is another thing that goes into this. The client's never, or pretty much never, going to have to create one of the entries in the bit categories channel because we have imported them up front. It's a fixed list, more or less. They add one once in a while. And also, the way our importer is set up in the real life project that this is based on, if there's a new one, it will just automatically get imported into the bit categories channel before a book ever gets assigned to it. So there was one of our complicated We've also got editions. An edition of a book. Those probably aren't a channel because they only ever apply to one book. There's only ever going to be a couple of them. 3, 5 at most, probably. Even if your book gets reprinted a zillion times, you're talking about maximum 20 or 30. So that's something that we can easily also do as a block. And I'm not going to go through all of it again. Okay, sorry, I thought maybe it was a question for me. Is this all making sense to people? Are you learning something? I'm really nervous.
It's making
I just
sense.
have one question. How did you handle pagination on the BIC or whatever? Because you're showing what? Parents, right?
Yeah. I use Stash.
Okay.
And actually, when you're talking about a publisher, there are so many of these damn bit categories. There aren't a whole lot of them that are going to have more than about 50 books. So you don't even necessarily need to paginate. But if you do need to paginate, Stash pagination works great. Stash, I didn't actually mention in the secret weapons, but boy, I mean, I have been a booster of Stash since way back. It's a super helpful tool for dealing with complicated situations with lists and categories and all of that stuff. Because Robin's right, pagination for category parents would otherwise be kind of a pain in the butt. So we've talked about editions. Authors. Those are a relationship because we're going to have an authors channel that is separate. So we already know, because we want authors to have their own URLs, to have photos, etc., that choice is kind of pre-made for us. We're not going to separately list the authors in, we're not going to separately type them into the books. We are just going to have them be a relationship of some sort or other. Pages are a channel, and I want to show you something else about blocks here. So we're going to actually go to content. I've already done this. Here's what content looks like, because what I find happens with snooty big clients especially is they want to be able to kind of art direct their content somewhat on pages. And blocks makes that really easy, because what we've done is we've actually created several block types. We've got a text and an image and a pull quote, and those are all assigned to the block. And then again, we get this really nice template code here that tells us exactly how we need to run through it to display it. You only get this after you save the field. It'll give you a nice little message before you save it that if you've made changes, you have to save it and re-enter it. But so then what happens when we go into create a page, is we actually get a weird thing with structure. So ignore that part because I don't know what's going on with it. But so we say we need a body text block. Oops, did that not work? Oh, I know why it didn't work, because something isn't running. Anyway, so we would put lorem ipsum in here. Here's an image. And if we try to save, we get some nice things that say, well, not only those are required, but we'll get a thing that says that we have a block that has one of its required fields missing. So it's really good about keeping track of that. News and events. Let's just talk about the kinds of things that a news channel has, because this will kind of, this is one of the areas where I wanted to focus. News, right? News has a byline. It's got a pub date. It's got some content. Yeah, it's got a header image probably. It's got maybe a video. It's got related authors, related books maybe, right? An event page has basically all of these same things, except it probably also has an end date. Otherwise, they're more or less identical. So we know that we can just use the same field group for both. We can just not require the end date. And then which is a sensible default for events anyway, frankly, because if you don't have an end date, it should just be a single day event, right? We also have a time, a start time and an end time for events. But we also don't need to require those. Or we could create a block that had those as required fields if you added them. And that actually would potentially be really handy, right? Because then you can do repeating events. You create a block that has a start date, start time, end date, end time. All of those can be required or not. And then if you need a repeating event, you put multiples in.
I'm sorry, can you clarify that? So I've got an event that I'm going to do this month and I'm going to do next month. So, and it's all going to have the same content, so I'm using a block to say...
Create a block and say it happens on this date at this time, and then it also happens on this date at this time. Repeat. Because remember, you can have as many blocks as you want. You can create limitations, but you can create repeating blocks. Which is handy because, like, if I wanted 10 paragraphs in that pages text, I would have to add more text.
You'd be creating the repeated event. You'd be creating the idea of having multiple events, but you wouldn't actually be copying the data.
Correct.
Not really creating any
And it depends on, and your workflow will determine whether that works for you. You might need to do something like Soul Space Calendar instead for repeating events, depending on what you need to show. But a lot of times, people don't care about having an actual calendar. They just want to be able to list their events. And a solution like this would work. But you can see that by sort of thinking this out in advance, we can group these fields together, and then we don't have to worry about having these multiple field groups. If we need something for one channel, we can always just add it. The reasons that this is good include the fact that you've ultimately got a column limit, right, in SQL. And on big sites, that can actually start being a problem. And also, it just slows things down. And it's annoying to template, because if you've got two identical fields and one of them's called, event start date and the other one's called news start date, well, why would, you want to think about that. There's also, I don't know, again, how many of you have seen entry type. Entry type is, I'll show it really quickly. I know we're kind of running out of time and I want to leave time for questions. And I still want to show you low variables. Entry type lets you basically say, it puts a drop down on the page, right? Or a radio button, whichever. And it lets you say, if it's this type of item, let's create one for you here. Entry type, type. It lets you say, if my item is of type book, I want to, for some reason, hide the subtitle category. Whereas if my event is, or if my book is of type magazine, these are completely nonsensical at this point, but if my event is of type magazine, it doesn't have big categories, so I want to hide those. And then what happens, whoops, trash that. No, trash it. Is that then when we go to create, am I on titles? Yep. Why is that not showing? Oh, because I'm not on titles, I'm creating, okay. Sorry. Live demo. Okay, so now we go to create titles. And if I say this is a book, then our subtitle should disappear. It's not, for some reason. But anyway, entry type does that. I have not, in fact, I tested this earlier and it worked. So apparently the magic of being on stage in front of a whole bunch of people I don't want to embarrass myself in front of has screwed things up. But this is also an advantage for published fields if you have things that you don't necessarily want to split into different channels. Like say you have an audio and video channel. That's actually a thing that my publisher site has. I don't want separate channels for audio and video because they're basically the same thing. It's not even just that they use the same field group. It's that I'm always going to be dumping them out on exactly the same page. But I don't want people accidentally pasting YouTube links in if this is an audio. I don't want people pasting SoundCloud links in if it's a video. So I just use entry type, and I make them choose that very first. I move it to the very top and say, if this is audio, then hide everything except the MP3 upload. If it's SoundCloud, hide everything except the SoundCloud link. If it's video, hide everything except the YouTube link. It's really handy because that is a thing you want to think about. Do these even need to be separate channels, or are they linked together so closely that we can just make them separate types? Now let's talk about boilerplate content quick. Boilerplate content can go into low variables. Low variables basically is an overlay on top of the native global variables functionality in ExpressionEngine, but it does two really important things. First of all, it lets you use a bunch more field types. You can have grids. You can't have blocks, sadly. They need to fix that. But you can have grids. You can have rich text fields. You can have most third-party field types include support for low vars these days. The other really important thing you can do is you can group your fields together. So One piece of boilerplate that nearly everybody has these days, or one set of pieces of boilerplate, is social media links, right? Everybody's site in the footer has social media links. You got a Twitter link, you got a Facebook link, you got whatever. So let's create a group called social media. And then inside that group, we can create a variable called Twitter link. And it can be URL. There are other useful things that that low variables gets you. It gets you some early parsing, which can be handy, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation because it's about templating. But for our purposes here, the nice things that it gets you are grouping variables and different variable types. So see here, in our social media group is our Twitter link. And then we can also create a boilerplate group that would contain our copyright footer. It would contain our header, mission statement, whatever. Another handy thing is you can create a group called client do not touch these variables, which I always end up doing because I tend to store some little reusable snippets in, because low variables also basically replaces the underlying EE snippets functionality because of the ability to early parse. So you can, and it allows you to save text type variables as files. So you can basically replace snippets and global variables with it, and all of your text ones will stay files. But so yeah, we can create as many groups as we want, basically, and group all of that good boilerplate content together. And then if we, for instance, need to translate to 4 other languages, we can create new variables in these types, like French copyright footer, Italian copyright footer, etc. And all of that stuff never has to go through the template, and that makes everybody much happier. I hope I've given you some stuff to chew on. Go ahead.
I'm curious why you'd want to replace snippets with global variables, because in E3, once they added the syncing, it's real nice.
Yeah, that's true. You can sync now with snippets and global variables. The low variables you can actually set to parse either before snippets or after snippets, and sometimes that actually gives you some useful tools for tweaking. You can actually have a snippet and a low variable and have them interacting with each other in useful ways. So, plus I have, it is only for EE2 so far. I need to convert it to EE3. I wrote it as a one-off and then decided I really do actually want to make it available. But I have an add-on in the works that lets you put low variables into the revisions table alongside templates and channel entries. And so that would be another reason you might want to use snippets, is that you also have the revisions table. I mean, if you're saving everything as files, hopefully you have it all in Git anyway. But we all know that clients sometimes make unauthorized changes, and sometimes it's helpful to also have that stuff in a revision table somewhere. Have I given you all some stuff to chew on? I hope that I did not make too much of a fool of myself here. Any questions? Yep.
So I couldn't agree more with the idea of all content should be in your content management system. Kind of makes sense. Not only is there separation of concerns, but you touched on translations and internationalization. So I just have a horror story of the past on a really big site with a lot of hard-coded content, and when it came to internationalizing that site, it was really painful having to go through and move everything out. So I totally agree. I just wondered how you handle navigation, because that's often a difficult one. It's something that, depending on a design, often needs to be hard-coded or restricted in some way.
Mm-hmm. One trick that I actually use pretty often for navigation is I actually create a low variables group called nav. And I would create a grid variable in there probably for like I actually do this a lot. New variable, utility. Yes, you create it as a grid type. here's a grid. We would say, you know, name and link. We'd require both, like so. And then when you save that, where are we? Sorry, I can't see very well. Yep, see here we have utility nav, and then we can just add a new row, etc. And then you just call that basically as one parsed chunk of code, and loop through and show your nav. That's really helpful. For main navigation, I tend to use structure, because ideally your structure tree should represent sort of the main nav of your site. But as you say, everybody's got like a utility nav in their footer. People sometimes have like separate shopping cart nav in the header. You can just lump all of that kind of content into low variables, put it in some nicely named groups, show the client where it is, and they love it. Go ahead.
I have two things. One, a comment. I disagree with both of you about not putting content in templates, and it's related to my second question, which is related to performance. Is there any concerns or things to think about with the techniques that you've shown so that content renders quickly?
The overhead, if you're calling any low variable anywhere on a page, low variables is already being invoked. So at that point, invoking it more than once for multiple variables is really negligible. I'm not going to say that it's not anything, because it's something, but I am going to say that if you're already invoking it in the parser anywhere, that it's basically a non-issue to have more than one thing calling it.
And also just cache the hell out of all the things.
Yeah, and you would always want to cache the hell out of your header and footer and stuff anyway. I'm not going to say that it's a zero concern, but I would definitely consider it to be premature optimization under most circumstances. You would want to check everything else that might be causing a performance problem before you thought that that was one of the things causing it. Go ahead.
I wondered if you had any, have you ever worked with nav-PE? I love it because you can
I have worked with nav-PE.
Different navigations everywhere. And so is there a performance difference that you've noticed?
No. Navi is actually a really good solution. There's also taxonomy for EE2, but I don't think he ever ported it to EE3, which was another one that I really liked. No, those are, again, it's probably a tiny bit of performance overhead. It's unlikely to ever really be an issue. It's just a matter of, are you making them buy another add-on? And sometimes it's going to be worth it, and sometimes it's not going to be worth it. Go ahead.
So I think I missed it while you were talking, where you had an option where you could hide certain fields instead of feature blocks?
No, it's called entry type. It's a free add-on. It's called entry type, and it's on Devotee. It was somehow magically not working here, but again, I really think it was just to embarrass me because it was working earlier.
Is that a field type?
It's a field type. It also has an extension that it loads with itself, but you don't ever have to worry about the extension part of it.
I think the reason it wasn't working is you were getting a jQuery error on there, which is what entry type uses.
Yes.
And once you get one error, it breaks all the jQuery on the site.
That's probably why. Thank you. It probably just, yeah. Any more questions?